Our apologies about that. Our next speaker was having troubles connecting her camera, and we wanted you to see her because we're very thrilled to have it with us today. Now, the keynote that you're about to listen to will be given to us by someone who has been working over the last 30 years on digital development. Already in 1988, she wrote a book about the age of the smart machine. And in 2014, the professor introduced the term surveillance capitalism. Until today, she has been a professor at Harvard Business School, thinking and teaching, and indeed about the future of our digital world. We're absolutely thrilled to welcome today Professor Shoshana Zuboff. Hello, Professor. Thank you so much for being here today with us.
Thank you for having me. It's a great pleasure. I've been looking forward to it.
Before I give you the floor for your speech, I would like to ask you, you've been working on these issues many years. What is it for you, the most exciting digital development in the last few decades?
I think the most exciting development is that the public is becoming aware of what's really at stake as we move into the digital century. You mentioned my first book, which was published in 1988, which is true, but I began the research for that book in 1978. And I was thinking about it the other day. In 1978, I decided that I wanted to study what I thought of at that time as the computerization of society. But I went around trying to raise money for my research. I was a Harvard student, and no one would give me any money. And every single institution said to me, information technology is no big deal. It's just the same, but faster. And now here we are, 43 years later, and it is impossible to engage in a discussion about democracy without immediately also being enmeshed in a discussion about the digital. And that to me is very exciting. I would say I spent many years feeling like I was shouting underwater. And now I feel like I'm in great conversation with a lot of people, including all of the great folks who are tuning in to us right now.
We're very much looking forward to hear more from you. So I leave you with the one and only Shoshana Zuboff.
Thank you so much. All right, so we don't have a lot of time, and I like to get right down to the issues. Let's think backwards for just a moment. A century ago, the corporate concentration of power was understood as economic power. Of course, owners had all the authority on the strength of their property rights, and the anti-democratic economic harms of concentration were understood as falling on people in their economic roles. So that means in our roles as workers, as consumers, and even as competitors. Well, decades of contest and collective action eventually produced antitrust laws in many countries, but also, and more importantly, the new charters of rights for workers and for consumers, the laws to protect those rights, and the institutions charged with their enforcement and governance. Without those rights, laws, and institutions, workers and consumers were literally naked and vulnerable in a world without rights. So here we are today. And as important as those 20th century institutions, those creations, remain for us today, they do not and cannot protect us from the new harms we face. In the age of surveillance capitalism, corporate power is not only economic, but social. I have called the economics that shape this new power surveillance capitalism for a very specific reason, because this new economic logic maintains core elements of traditional capitalism, of course, private property, market exchange, growth and profit, but these cannot be realized without the distinctly 21st century technologies and social relations of surveillance. That means hidden methods of observation secretly consume what we've always thought of as our private experience and translate it into behavioral data. Then, in an extraordinary development, these ill-gotten human-generated data are immediately claimed as corporate property, available for manufacture and sales. The data travel to computational factories, they're computed into behavioral predictions, they're sold to new business customers in a new kind of market that trades in predictive knowledge of human behavior. These are commodity markets, but they're not trading in wheat or oil or pork bellies. They're trading in human futures. The anti-democratic social harms produced by these operations are no longer confined to individuals in their roles as workers and consumers. They fall upon a new category of humanity. We're called users. But that means all of us, all the time, everywhere. Ours is a young information civilization that has not yet found its footing in democracy because the social harms we face cannot be shoehorned into Cinderella's 20th century legal slipper. So now it is we who march naked, without the rights, the laws, and the institutions purpose-built to govern our digital century in the name of democracy. In an information civilization, the principles of social order derive from essential questions of knowledge, authority, and power, but as they pertain to information. And if you don't remember what I've just said, then remember this: the three essential questions of our time. Who knows? Who knows? Who decides who knows? And who decides who decides who knows? The distribution of knowledge, the authority over that distribution, and the power to defend that authority. The problem is that today, surveillance capitalist firms, beginning with the giants, now hold the answers to each question, though we never elected them to govern. On the strength of their property claims, the private surveillance empires have mounted a fundamentally anti-democratic epistemic coup, a revolutionary takeover of knowledge and knowing. They decide what is known, who can know it, and to what purpose. The social harms that follow from this revolution leave lawmakers and the public continually whipsawed by each day's headlines, bleating the latest atrocity. Our comprehension, however, is obstructed by category errors. Social harms, such as the wholesale destruction of privacy, which has occurred over the last 2 decades as surveillance capitalism rooted and flourished, or disinformation, or polarizing speech, or information flows corrupted by defactualization and bias, or massive scale behavioral modification, or unaccountable power. Each of these social harms has been siloed in our thinking and treated as a distinct phenomenon, leaving us in a tangle of disorientation, fragmentation, and confusion. As long as we view these harms as distinct and unrelated problems, they will remain impossible for us to solve. The perspective of surveillance capitalism as a revolutionary institutional order offers a way out of this frenzy. This institution reaches across the boundaries of individuals, organizations, sectors, communities, societies, and nations, re-intermediating virtually all human engagement with digital architectures, devices, products, services, information flows. Surveillance capitalism, like all institutions, is self-reproducing. All of its action flows toward self-extension. All of its action flows toward self-reproduction. No matter how much we may beg individual leaders to please, please change, that self-reproduction of an institutional order overpowers everything. I think it must be clear to you that surveillance economics are not the inevitable consequence of digital technologies, not at all. Surveillance capitalism is not a corporation and it's not a person. Surveillance capitalism is an institutional order. It is the digital era iron cage. And while democracy slept, it has been allowed to own, to operate, and to mediate the entire digital surround. Right now, all roads to economic and social participation lead through the institutional terrain of surveillance capitalism, a fact that has only grown in ferocity during these years of global plague. The economic institution of surveillance capitalism is the unified field against which these anti-democratic social harms we face are revealed as linked effects of a single cause. The epistemic coup is a unitary process, a single cause that has unfolded in 4 stages. Each of these stages is a demonstration of economic cause, developing economic causes as surveillance capitalism has grown and flourished and intensified. So these economic causes and their social harm effect at each stage. And each stage develops the conditions and builds the scaffolding for the next stage. So this is how they're all interlinked in a developmental process. Let me define these stages just very, very briefly because we don't have a lot of time to go into it, but perhaps during questions, if there's time and you want to know more, we can discuss in more detail. Stage 1 is foundational, and of course that begins with the massive scale secret extraction of human generated data, which leads to stage 2, the unexpected and anti-democratic nature of the concentration of knowledge, now deeply asymmetrical. And that has become the basis for a surprising new form of social inequality, epistemic inequality, defined as the difference between what I can know and what can be known about me. Stage 3 now. This is where knowledge turns into power. Proprietary knowledge gathered in stage 1 and concentrated in stage 2 is now weaponized for behavioral prediction and targeting, producing social harms from behavior modification to widespread epistemic chaos as corrupt information is amplified by machine systems that are engineered to maximize extraction and improve prediction. There's the economic logic driving towards self-reproduction and self-extension. Finally, in stage 4, which exploits all of these earlier conditions and builds on them, what we see here are increasingly aggressive shows of epistemic dominance as corporate surveillance empires now vie with democracy over the fundamental rights and legal principles that govern our societies. And they do this by leveraging their absolute and unaccountable power over mission-critical information systems and infrastructures. And when I say mission-critical, I mean mission-critical to society. The aim here is to divide people from their governments, to substitute computational systems for society. and ultimately to assert computational governance in the place of democracy. Capitalism in the digital century could have taken many forms, but the world's liberal democracies have thus far failed to construct a coherent political vision of a digital century that advances democratic principles in government. In contrast, the Chinese, for example, have learned how to design and deploy digital technologies that advance their system of authoritarian rule, strategies that have become central to their domestic and foreign policies. The West's failure has left a void, and that void was filled by surveillance capitalism. As a result, democracy is under the kind of siege that only democracy can end. Democracy is the only countervailing institutional order with the legitimate authority and power to change our course. If this crucial third decade of the digital century is to be the tipping point, which I believe it must be, then every solution points to one solution: a democratic counter-revolution. Make no mistake, this is the fight for the soul of our information civilization. And in this fight now, everything depends on politics. There is no doubt in my mind that the democratic counter-revolution is underway. And to complete these remarks, I'll just give you a little bit of discussion about my thinking about the signs that this counter-revolution is underway. First of all, I think that for this counter-revolution to succeed, three conditions must be met. First, a public awakening and mobilization into action. Second, a step change in lawmakers' comprehension and determination to act with laws for a new century that are purpose-built to preserve democracy from unprecedented social harms and build that vision of a democratic digital future. And third, a powerful transnational conversation and collaboration where all of that which was assumed to be undiscussable, inevitable, settled, and too powerful to contest is finally revealed as a highly contingent human invention and a violation of the most basic principles of supply and demand. All we have is surveillance capitalism, and all we want is something else. The new conversation recognizes that big tech companies are not shining pillars of entrepreneurship and innovation, but actually ruthless and wily monopolists whose trillion-dollar companies are built on a social harm machine that perfected illicit data extraction and the universal destruction of privacy, and is now on course to unravel the sociological and psychological substrates upon which the very premise of democracy rests. All of it leaving we the people as helpless bystanders to the demolition of social norms and foundational institutions. So very quickly now to wrap up, as to the first condition, the public awakening, data from the last few years actually reveal a decisive rupture of faith with surveillance capitalism. We see it in the large surveys, in the discontent and defection of tech employees, in expert analyses from all over the world, as well as journalistic accounts from every corner of the globe. And of the many data that I could cite, I want to share with you just one data point that I hope you'll find as interesting as I do. In April of 2020, the outset of pandemic, Eric Schmidt, former Google CEO, opined that the pandemic would teach Americans to be, quote, a little bit grateful for powerful tech companies. Now, according to a very good survey published last week, And if you know anything about survey research, it's very unusual to see very, very high majorities. In this survey published just last week, mid-September 2021, an extraordinary 93% of respondents agreed with the following statement: it should be illegal for private companies to collect information about people without their permission. That is extraordinary, a blow to the heart of surveillance capitalism. The public itself is asking us to redefine illicit data extraction as theft. The foundation of surveillance capitalism, illegitimate power, is being rejected by the public. And I should add, these were US data, and I'm okay using US data in this case because I think, as most of us understand, Americans have been a little bit late to this party. While Europe was working on the GDPR, Americans really, were not sharing a lot of that feeling and a lot of those perspectives. So to see this happening in an American data survey is really pretty extraordinary. Now, as to the second condition, lawmakers have begun to show their mettle as well, and now even stronger as they feel the public at their backs, with a new insistence that the digital must live in democracy's house. And I just want to stress here that although it doesn't always feel like it when you're in Brussels and when you're in the parliaments of the member states, the fact is that Europe continues to lead the way, and Europe actually must lead the way. When we combine the new legislative proposals, the Digital Services Act, the Digital Markets Act, the proposals for democratic governance of AI, these legislative proposals, they don't have all the solutions. They're not all the final answers, but they do the work of finally putting us on a democratic trajectory, tying data collection to fundamental rights, tying data use to public service. And all the work that's going on now in the EU Parliament, the debates, the amendments, the debates in the member states are all part of this emerging democratic vision. And finally, we're seeing the same kind of strength emerging in the US, with many bills having been introduced recently that go to the heart of surveillance capitalism, and a growing cadre of lawmakers who understand that surveillance economics are the cause of these social harms that we've been discussing. And as to the third condition, the transnational dialogue, I offer one brief example in alignment with that 93% who would outlaw secret data extraction. Now we've got lawmakers and citizens on both sides of the Atlantic who are converging on the idea of banning surveillance advertising, which is, of course, the first and most public-facing product of illegitimate data extraction. And this is a proposal that would have been considered unthinkable, undiscussable, only a few years ago. In March, US Congressional Representatives Eshoo and Schakowsky announced that they're working on a bill to ban surveillance advertising. In June, member of European Parliament Alexandra Geese and US Congresswoman Lori Trahan held a public discussion on banning surveillance-based advertising. That month, nearly 50 global civil rights and civil society institutions delivered their People's Declaration to the EU Parliament in advance of debates on amendments to the Digital Services Act. That declaration now has been signed by nearly 100 organizations demanding an end to surveillance capitalism and a ban on surveillance advertising. And just last week, mid-September 2021, the Financial Times reported on new European Commission proposals for hard rules to curb the power of micro-targeting. This kind of convergence of citizens and lawmakers will fulfill the promise of the third decade, finally altering our civilizational course and asserting that there is no such place as cyberspace or any other space exempt from society's rights and laws. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Professor, for that very insightful overview of the current affairs and the challenges that we are facing indeed, and the profound discussion that we need to have about how these digital developments affect to our society. We don't have more time for questions, but I would like to thank you again, because it was really a pleasure of having you with us today. Thank you so much again, Professor, for your contribution.